Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. The 4th of July weekend is upon us, and it got me wondering about King George, what he was like, and how he was as a leader. So George III was born in England, and he was the third Hanoverian monarch and the first one to be born in England, and he was the first to use English as his first language. He became the king at the age of 22. King George III is the longest reigning of the British kings. Though both Queen Victoria and Elizabeth II celebrated Diamond Jubilees in the commemoration of 60 years on the throne, George III died 9 months short of this anniversary on January 29th, 1820. Was he really mad? According to HistoryHit.com, George III's reputation has sometimes been overshadowed by his mental instability. He experienced profound mental illness in 1788 and 1789, that prompted speculation about his ability to rule, and his eldest son, George IV, acted as Prince Regent from 1811 until George's death in 1820. He was reported to have symptoms including babbling unintelligibly, frothing at the mouth, and becoming abusive. And some medical historians have said that George III's mental instability was caused by an hereditary physical disorder called porphyria. I hope I said that right. Time.com said that King George had a bipolar disorder and not porphyria. And it was the ministers and the generals and the admirals who lost the American colonies, with George not taking part in grand strategy making and going along with the cabinet decisions as a constitutional monarch. So George III, he took great pity on others suffering from mental distress. In 1786, he was attacked by Margaret Nicholson, who tried to plunge a pudding knife into his chest. She was immediately rough-handled away, and George cried out, "The poor creature is mad. Do not hurt her. She has not hurt me," and ensured that she was taken to Bethlehem Hospital for treatment. Prior to his decline, at the age of 73, George III was incapacitated for a total duration of less than a year and was otherwise committed to his duties. Well, the king loved agriculture. George III had an interest in botany and was the first king to study science as part of his education. He owned a collection of scientific instruments now in the Science Museum in London, while his architectural interests extended to the authorship of articles on the topic, and he acquired the nickname Farmer George during his reign. He was also into clockmaking, and he bought the most advanced instruments and would take them apart to study them. The king went to Richmond Observatory every day at noon for 10 weeks in order to test John Harrison's H5 clock personally. George was into education. About ProQuest.com stated that George III was also known for his interest in the sciences. The first monarch to be educated in science, he built a well-stocked library and had the Kew Observatory erected so that he and his wife could see the transit of Venus. The king knew it would be hundreds of years before the event would occur again, and being a studious man with consideration for the future, he organized to have the event thoroughly recorded. King George even dispatched observers to various countries around the world to measure distance and time by recording at what point the observers were able to see and what he was seeing in the Kew Observatory. And according to E. Foyner de Alba, writing in the Observer newspaper in 1927, King George III personally took observations and was the first to see the penumbra of Venus. Not only a prominent of astrology, King George was also passionate about physics, chemistry, and mathematics. He collected as well as commissioned an array of apparatus and instruments now housed in London's Science Museum. King George III created Buckingham Palace. He bought Buckingham House, and it was for his wife Charlotte, and it was near St. James' Place, which held court functions. It became known as the Queen's Place for Queen Charlotte. And then later, Queen Victoria was the first monarch to take up residence there. The king married in 1761, and George asked his tutor, Lord Bute, to help review eligible German Protestant princesses to save a great deal of trouble. Well, it sounded like it was a bit of a business arrangement, but King George III was devoted to her, and they ended up having 15 children together, with 13 making it to adulthood. So the children were the apple of his eye, and visitors to Kew and Windsor were often caught by the sight of the king playing with his children. In 1785, Mrs. Delaney noted the beautiful babe Amelia playing with a huge pleasure with the king upon the carpet. Although it's unlikely that the king ever changed a diaper, he was heavily involved in the lives of his children, visiting the nursery every morning at dawn to inquire how the children had slept in the night. Well, some can criticize George maybe for interfering too much in their children's lives because in adulthood, the princesses would resent the control exerted over them by their parents. And he was a cultured king. Royal.uk stated that he was one of the most cultured of the monarchs. George III started a new royal collection of books. 65,000 of his books were later given to the British Museum as the nucleus of a national library, and he opened his library to scholars. Next, we find out that George wasn't a tyrant after all. According to Time.com, George was simply not tyrannical. Rather, he was a good-natured, enlightened, constitutional monarch who, inconveniently for the founders, the founding fathers that is, he generally admired the glorious revolution of 1688 as much as they did, not at least because it paved the way for his family to come to the British throne, despite his great-grandfather George I only being the 51st in line. So Queen Elizabeth II released 100,000 pages of George III's papers, and it was curated by the George Papers program in London, and it revealed that the king was a man who was horrified at the concept of royalist tyranny, as practiced occasionally on the European continent, and he denounced it at every opportunity. He was also enamored of the Magna Carta and the English common law that he never considered trying to use extra legal powers against the American Revolution until the first shots had been fired at Lexington and Concord. And at that time, George III also wanted his American subjects to enjoy life, liberty, as he conceived it, and the pursuit of happiness until such time that roughly 1/3 of them started to rebel against him. John Adams estimated that the revolution started another 1/3 were loyalists, and then the last 1/3 were waiting to see who would win. So George III was a humble king. He preferred to eat frugally, breakfasting on only dry toast and weak tea. When he was taken to the Kew for treatment in 1804, the kitchens were in a separate building. A housekeeper recalled later that the king insisted on bathing in the kitchens to save the servants the trouble of carrying the hot water. When historic royal palaces restored the kitchen in 2012, they discovered a fine late 1700s bathtub stuffed up the chimney. It could only have been George III's. So it's interesting to see that George III was a totally different man than history has sometimes portrayed him. A thread in Reddit said it well. Originally, the Americans didn't even want independence, just the repeal of the harsh laws. In the petition to the king, the First Continental Congress, the colonists were calling themselves His Majesty's faithful subjects in North America. A more accurate retelling of the American Revolution would speak of the incompetent Prime Minister, Lord North, instead of King George the Tyrant. A lot of good things happened for Britain during his reign as well, such as the defeat of the French and the abolishment of the transatlantic slave trade. ThoughtCo.com said that under huge pressure to curb spending, the British king and the government believed that any further attempts to tax the homeland would be a failure. They thus seized upon other sources of income, one of which was taxing American colonists in order to pay for the army that was protecting them. America would have broken off with England even knowing the king wasn't as bad as he was portrayed. The king himself didn't have much power, and it was up to the parliament and the prime minister. And the king stood behind this group, and the inevitable happened. As a statesman, King George was well liked by the public, including America, even as they poked fun at his eccentricities, and respected by most of the parliament. A patron, he supported technology advancement during the first few years of the Industrial Revolution. And as a monarch, he made himself into an effective figure of national resistance against the threat of Napoleon Bonaparte. Most importantly, George's style of rule, favoring background stability and trusting Parliament to decide on most policy, provided an important precedent for his successors. George III has been redeemed in recent years, and we see that he was a very interesting man, a good leader, loved his family and his subjects. He had a mental illness, but he was only incapacitated by it near the end of his reign. So truth always comes to light eventually. Now, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I hope everybody's been having a good day, and tune in again soon for Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.